Today I'd like to talk a little bit about the formation of the Canadian Women's Army Corps. Prior to World War II, the women generally worked at home. There weren't many positions for them, working in restaurants, working in hospitals and so on. So they formed many groups to help the disabled people or the military people. At the start of the Second World War, there were unofficial units formed across Canada. This uniform is one of those type of units, and they designed their own uniform, their own patches on it, and this one would be 1939 into 1940. A unit that was formed in BC was the Women's Voluntary Reserve Corps. A unit formed in Quebec was the Canadian Beavers. And on the side cap is the cap badge of the Canadian Beavers. When the two units got together, they formed the Women's Voluntary Reserve Corps. A woman who was behind this in BC was a Mrs. Kennedy. And Mrs. Kennedy went across Canada talking to women's groups, talking to the military to try to get a unit formed that combined all of these unofficial units. When eventually the unit was formed, and it was formed as amalgamation of the smaller units, and Mrs. Kennedy was the first recruit, the first commanding officer, and the first colonel. And that was all in the same day. Eventually, she became a liaison officer for the Canadian Women's Army Corps, going across the country talking to women's groups. The first women to go overseas were in 1942. In 1942, 100 women and 10 officers landed in England. And the commanding officer of that group was Captain Frances Riley, and this is her uniform. When they came off the ship through the receiving area in Great Britain, they broke into songs, and they sang patriotic songs and songs of the time. They were written up in all the newspapers about these crazy Canadian women. The uniforms the officers wore initially were the same as the enlisted staff, but later on, especially if they happened to go to England, the material was much better. They were similar to the men who were officers in England. They would go to the local terrier and have a uniform made for them. And this is one that was been manufactured in England. During the Second World War, 25 women in the Canadian Women's Army Corps died. These are the medals to one of those women. This woman died of sickness, and it was buried in Canada.